He was perfect, she would sob every single night. My entire existence has been spent trying to live up to an angel who supposedly died at age 5. Yesterday, I discovered my birth certificate, where I'm listed as the only child. Growing up, our house felt like a shrine. The front bedroom was his room, perfectly preserved with toys from the early 2000s, clothes folded neatly in drawers, and a twin bed that was never slept in but always had fresh sheets. Mom would sit in there for hours, just staring at old photographs that showed a little boy who looked exactly like me at that age. She'd trace her fingers along the picture frames and whisper about how much she missed him. Every morning started the same way. Mom would lay out clothes on my bed, hand-me-downs that supposedly belonged to him. Striped shirts that were slightly too small, jeans with patches on the knees, sneakers that pinched my feet. When I complained or asked for new clothes, she'd get this distant look in her eyes and tell me how ungrateful I was being. These weren't just clothes, they were memories. Sacred pieces of a life cut short. The worst part was how she'd compare everything I did to what he would have done. When I brought home a B+ on a math test, she'd shake her head sadly and mention how he was always so brilliant with numbers. When I scored a goal in Little League, instead of celebrating, she'd get teary-eyed and talk about how he would have been the star of the team if he'd lived long enough. Nothing I accomplished was ever mine. It was always measured against the ghost of a boy who cast a shadow over every moment of my childhood. School was its own kind of torture. Other kids would ask about siblings, and I'd have to explain about my dead brother. Teachers would give me those pitying looks when Mom mentioned him during parent conferences. I became known as the kid with the tragic family story, which made making friends incredibly difficult. How do you have normal conversations when your entire identity is built around someone else's death? As I got older, the obsession only intensified. Mom started buying me clothes in the exact style she claimed he wore, even though fashion had moved on years ago. She'd insist I cut my hair the same way, eat the same foods, even sleep in the same position she said he preferred. It was like she was trying to keep him alive through me, but in doing so, she was slowly erasing who I actually was. High school brought new challenges. Dating was practically impossible because Mom would break down crying whenever I mentioned being interested in someone. She'd go on and on about how he would have found the perfect girl, how he would have been so charming and sweet. Any girlfriend I managed to bring home would be subjected to endless stories about this perfect brother who overshadowed every aspect of my teenage years. College offered a brief escape. For the first time in my life, I could make decisions without his ghost haunting every choice. I picked my own clothes, chose my own major, made friends who knew nothing about my family's tragedy. But even then, the guilt followed me. Mom would call crying, saying how much she missed both of us, how empty the house felt without her boys. The weight of being the only living reminder of a dead child was crushing, even from hundreds of miles away. After graduation, financial pressure forced me to move back home. The house hadn't changed at all. His room was still perfectly preserved. My old bedroom still had the same furniture from when I was 12, and Mom had somehow gotten even more obsessed with maintaining his memory. She'd started talking to his pictures, setting places for him at dinner, and buying birthday presents every year that would just sit unopened on his dresser. Living there as an adult was suffocating in ways I hadn't experienced as a kid. Every conversation circled back to him. Every meal was eaten in the shadow of his empty chair. Every family photo on the walls showed this progression of me growing up while he remained forever frozen at age 5. The psychological toll was immense, but I felt trapped by obligation and guilt. How do you abandon your grieving mother? How do you walk away from someone who's already lost so much? The breaking point came last month when I started planning to propose to my longtime girlfriend. When I mentioned my intentions to Mom, she had what I can only describe as a complete breakdown. She screamed about how he would never get to experience love, never get married, never give her grandchildren. She accused me of being selfish for wanting happiness when he was dead in the ground. The rage and resentment in her voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard, and it made me realize how deeply sick our family dynamic had become. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about her reaction felt wrong beyond the usual grief. I started thinking about all the inconsistencies in the stories she'd told over the years. Details that never quite lined up, dates that didn't make sense, relatives who seemed confused when I'd mention him. A horrible suspicion began forming in the back of my mind. one that I'd been unconsciously pushing away for years. The next morning, while Mom was at the grocery store, I did something I'd never had the courage to do before. I went through her important documents, looking for anything that might give me answers. Birth certificates, medical records, insurance papers, anything that might shed light on the truth I was starting to suspect. What I found in that manila folder changed everything I thought I knew about my life. My birth certificate showed only one child. Medical records from when I was born showed no mention of any other children. Insurance documents, tax returns, school enrollment forms, everything pointed to the same impossible conclusion. There was no brother. There had never been a brother. The person I'd spent my entire life living in the shadow of had never actually existed. Update 1. The discovery hit me like a physical blow. I sat on the floor of Mom's bedroom, surrounded by documents that proved I'd been living a lie for 24 years. My hands were shaking as I went through everything again and again, hoping I'd missed something, hoping there was some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. But the evidence was undeniable. Every official record showed that I was an only child. I thought back to all the photographs she'd shown me over the years. Pictures of him at birthday parties, playing in the backyard, sitting on Santa's lap at the mall. With this new perspective, I realized they were all pictures of me. She'd somehow convinced herself that these were photos of two different children, but they were all just me at different ages. The little boy she'd been mourning for 2 decades was sitting right in front of her every day. When Mom came home from the store, I was still sitting there with the documents spread around me. She took one look at my face and knew immediately what had happened. But instead of the explanation or apology I was expecting, she just started crying. Not the theatrical, dramatic crying she usually did when talking about him, but quiet, broken sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. I asked her to tell me the truth, to explain what had been going on all these years. What she told me was so much worse than I could have imagined. After I was born, she'd apparently suffered from severe postpartum depression. But instead of getting help, she'd created an elaborate fantasy where she'd had 2 sons instead of 1. In her mind, the perfect, idealized version of me had died, leaving behind only the disappointing reality of who I actually was. She explained it like she was describing a movie plot, completely detached from the reality of what she'd done to me. In her version of events, she'd given birth to twins, one perfect, one flawed. The perfect one had died tragically, leaving her to raise the inferior copy. Every time I disappointed her, every time I failed to live up to her impossible standards, it reinforced her delusion that I was the wrong child, the one who should have died instead. The clothes, the comparisons, the endless stories about his achievements. It was all her way of keeping the fantasy alive. She'd convinced herself so thoroughly that this other version of me had existed that she'd built an entire mythology around him. Birthday parties she'd never thrown, achievements I'd never accomplished, personality traits I'd never displayed. All of it became part of his story instead of mine. What made it even more disturbing was realizing that she wasn't exactly lying. In her mind, he was real. She'd genuinely grieved for this imaginary child for over 20 years. The pain in her voice when she talked about missing him was authentic, even though the person she was missing had never actually existed. It was like she'd split her image of me into 2 people, the son she wanted and the son she was stuck with. I spent the next few days in a complete daze, trying to process what this meant for my entire understanding of myself and my family. Every memory I had was tainted by this revelation. Every moment of feeling inadequate compared to him. Every time I'd wished I could be more like the brother I'd never had. Every instance of guilt for being alive when he wasn't. All of it was based on nothing but my mother's broken psyche. The anger came in waves. Rage at her for stealing my childhood, for making me feel like a replacement instead of a person in my own right, for 24 years of psychological manipulation disguised as grief. But underneath the anger was something even worse, pity. Looking at her now, I could see how truly damaged she was, how completely she'd lost touch with reality in order to cope with whatever had broken inside her after my birth. I tried to talk to her about getting help, about seeing someone who could untangle the mess in her head. But she'd become defensive and paranoid, insisting that I was the one who was confused, that I was trying to erase his memory out of jealousy. She'd point to his room, his clothes, his pictures, as proof that he'd existed. The physical evidence of her delusion had become more real to her than actual reality. Update 2. Things got exponentially worse over the next week. Mom became increasingly erratic, talking to empty air as if she was having conversations with him, setting out meals for 3 people instead of 2, and spending hours in his room having what sounded like arguments with someone who wasn't there. I realized that confronting her with the truth hadn't helped. It had actually made her retreat deeper into the fantasy. I started researching postpartum psychosis and found stories that were eerily similar to ours. Women who'd created elaborate delusions about children who'd died, who'd never existed, or who'd been taken away. The medical literature described it as a way for the mind to process trauma or extreme stress, but reading about it clinically didn't make living with it any less terrifying. The breaking point came when I found her in the basement, going through old boxes and pulling out baby clothes. She was sorting them into 2 piles, muttering under her breath about getting ready for something. When I asked what she was doing, she looked up at me with eyes that seemed completely disconnected from reality and told me she was preparing for the reunion. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Something about the way she'd talked made me feel like there was more to this story, something she hadn't told me yet. I waited until she was asleep and went back down to the basement to see what she'd been working on. What I found hidden in an old shoebox made my blood run cold. There were notebooks filled with her handwriting, dating back years. Page after page of detailed plans, schedules, and what looked like countdown calendars. The content was disturbing beyond anything I could have imagined. She'd been planning something she called the reunion for my entire adult life, waiting for the right moment to make it happen. According to her notes, she believed that when I turned 25, I would need to join him so they could be together again. She'd convinced herself that I was only a temporary placeholder, that my real purpose was to eventually die so that her perfect son could be whole again. The notebooks contained detailed plans for how she intended to make this happen, written in the same loving tone she used when talking about his memory. Reading those pages, I realized that my mother wasn't just delusional, she was dangerous. The woman who'd raised me, who'd claimed to love me despite constantly comparing me to a ghost, had been planning my death for years. Every birthday, every holiday, every moment of what I'd thought was maternal love had been colored by her belief that I was living on borrowed time. The most chilling part was how methodical it all was. She'd researched different methods, planned out timing, even written what looked like a suicide note that was supposed to be from me. In her twisted logic, it would look like I'd finally given up under the weight of living in my brother's shadow and chosen to join him. She'd planned to frame my murder as a tragic suicide, allowing her to finally grieve for both of her sons publicly. I realized that my 25th birthday was only 3 weeks away. According to her timeline, she'd been planning to act soon. The reunion she'd been preparing for wasn't some metaphorical healing. It was my death. The woman who'd raised me had been counting down the days until she could kill me, believing that somehow this would bring back the perfect child who'd never existed in the first place. That night, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't sleep under the same roof as someone who'd been planning my murder for years, even if she was too mentally ill to fully understand what she was doing. I drove to my girlfriend's apartment and tried to explain what I discovered, but the words sounded insane even to me. How do you tell someone that your mother has been planning to kill you because she thinks you're the wrong version of yourself? The next few days were a blur of phone calls to authorities, mental health professionals, and family members I'd barely spoken to in years. Everyone was shocked by what had been going on, but several relatives admitted they'd always thought something was off about Mom's grief. Apparently, the intensity of her mourning had seemed excessive even for someone who'd lost a child, but no one had wanted to question a grieving mother's pain. Social services got involved, and Mom was eventually admitted to a psychiatric facility for evaluation. The house was searched, and they found even more evidence of her elaborate delusion. Rooms full of artwork supposedly created by him, report cards with his name on them that she'd forged, even medical records she'd falsified to support the story of his death. Final update. It's been 6 months since everything came to light, and I'm still processing the full scope of what my mother did to me. The psychiatric evaluation confirmed what I'd suspected. She'd been suffering from a severe form of postpartum psychosis that had gone untreated for over 2 decades. The stress of becoming a parent had triggered something in her brain that created an alternate reality where her disappointment in me could be explained away by the existence of a perfect child who'd died. The doctors explained that this type of delusion often serves as a protective mechanism for parents who feel overwhelmed by the reality of raising a child. Instead of acknowledging that she was struggling with motherhood, her mind created a scenario where her difficulties with me were justified by the loss of someone better. It was easier for her to believe that I was a poor substitute for a dead child than to accept that she was simply a mother who was struggling with mental illness. The house has been sold, and Mom is in a long-term care facility that specializes in treating severe psychiatric conditions. The doctors are cautiously optimistic that with proper medication and therapy, she might eventually be able to distinguish between reality and the fantasy she created. But they've also warned me that recovery from this level of delusion is rarely complete, and there's no guarantee she'll ever fully acknowledge what actually happened. I've been staying with my girlfriend and her family while I figure out what comes next. They've been incredibly supportive, but I can see the strain that all of this has put on our relationship. How do you move forward with someone when you're not even sure who you actually are underneath all the psychological manipulation? I'm 25 now, the age when I was supposed to die according to Mom's plan, and I'm still trying to figure out what it means to exist as myself instead of as a disappointing shadow of someone who never lived. The strangest part has been going through all of his belongings and realizing they were always mine. The clothes I wore, the toys in his room, the achievements Mom attributed to him, they were all things from my own childhood that she'd rewritten to fit her fantasy. I found art projects with my name crossed out and is written in, report cards that had been altered to show better grades than I'd actually received, even photographs where she'd somehow convinced herself she was seeing two different children. I've started seeing a counselor who specializes in psychological abuse, and she's helped me understand that what happened to me was a form of identity theft that went on for my entire life. My mother didn't just create an imaginary child. She stole pieces of my real accomplishments and personality to build him, leaving me with the scraps of who I was supposed to be. The process of reclaiming my own history and identity has been more difficult than I ever imagined. There are still days when I catch myself thinking about him as if he were real. 24 years of conditioning doesn't disappear overnight, and sometimes I'll have a moment of sadness about the brother I never had before, remembering that he never existed in the first place. It's like grieving for someone while simultaneously realizing there's nothing to grieve for, which creates this weird emotional loop that's hard to break out of. The legal system has been surprisingly understanding about the whole situation. Since Mom was clearly mentally ill and had been for decades, the focus has been on getting her treatment rather than punishment. But I've had to file restraining orders and change my name legally just to make sure I can build a life that she can't interfere with if she ever gets out of the facility. My relationship with my girlfriend has actually grown stronger through all of this. She's helped me see that the person I am, flaws and all, is valuable in ways that Mom's perfect fantasy child never could have been. I'm learning to appreciate my real accomplishments instead of measuring them against impossible standards, and I'm slowly building an identity that belongs to me instead of being a reaction to someone else's expectations. The hardest part has been accepting that I'll never get those 24 years back. I'll never know who I might have become if I'd been allowed to develop naturally instead of constantly trying to live up to a ghost. But I'm starting to see that maybe that's okay. Maybe the person I am now, shaped by this bizarre and traumatic experience, has something to offer the world that a more conventional upbringing wouldn't have produced. I still think about Mom sometimes, wondering if she ever has moments of clarity where she realizes what she did to me. The doctors say that even if she recovers, she'll probably never fully understand the impact her delusion had on my development. In a way, that might be for the best. The guilt of realizing she'd spent my entire childhood trying to turn me into someone else, and then planned to kill me when I turned 25, might be too much for her to handle. As for me, I'm 25 years old and finally learning how to be myself instead of trying to be someone who never existed. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. Every choice I make now is mine. Every accomplishment belongs to me, and every failure is something I can learn from instead of evidence that I'm not living up to someone else's memory. For the first time in my life, I'm enough exactly as I am, and that's a feeling I never thought I'd experience. The brother who cast a shadow over my entire childhood is finally gone, not because he died, but because I've accepted that he was never alive in the first place. And in letting go of him, I found something I didn't even know I was looking for, the chance to be the person I was always meant to be, without apology or comparison to anyone else.